too.
Yeah, we got more of us.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome, every one of you. I'd like to begin by welcoming Mayor of Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke, and the Mayor of East St. Louis, Gordon Bush. I'd like to thank the members of Congress here behind me who are so responsible for the purpose for which we are called today. I want to acknowledge Congresswoman Donna Christian Green, Congressman Elijah Cummings, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, Congressman Donald Payne. I will say more about Congresswoman Maxine Waters and Representative Lou Stokes in a moment. But I want to thank them and all the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, including all the House members and Senator Carol Moseley Braun for what they did. And then I would like to offer a special word of appreciation to Senator Arlen Specter and Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, who helped us so much to get this done. Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator. I want to thank everyone in our administration who's worked so hard on the issue of HIV and AIDS, beginning with the Vice President, who couldn't be here today, but who has worked very hard on all these issues, and Secretary Shalala, our wonderful Surgeon General, David Satcher, the Director of our AIDS Policy Office, Sandy Thurman, who has literally spent months sounding the alarm about the growing crisis in communities of color and working to help achieve these dramatic funding increases. There is no stronger or more effective advocate, and I think we ought to thank Sandy Thurman for what she's done. Thank you. Finally, I want to thank Denise Stokes for being here. As you will hear in a few moments, she has been living with HIV for 15 years and has been giving so much of herself to educate others. If we are to stop this cruel disease, we'll have to have brave people like Denise to reach out with candor and compassion to those at risk. I really admire her very much, and you'll hear from her in a moment, but I think we ought to give her a hand for showing it today. We have good reason to feel encouraged that so many HIV-positive men and women are living longer and healthier lives. We should be proud that we've helped to speed the development of life-saving therapies and nearly triple funding to support those with HIV and AIDS. But the AIDS epidemic is far from over in any community in our country. Today, we're here to send out a word loud and clear. AIDS is a particularly severe and ongoing crisis in the African American and Hispanic communities and in other communities of color. African Americans represent only 13% of our population, but account for almost half the new AIDS cases reported last year. Hispanics represent 10% of our population. They account for more than 20% of the new AIDS cases. And AIDS is becoming a critical concern in some Native American and Asian American communities as well. Like other epidemics before it, AIDS is now hitting hardest in areas where knowledge about the disease is scarce and poverty is high. In other words, as so often happens, it is picking on the most vulnerable among us. The fact is, HIV infection is one of the most deadly health disparities between African Americans, Hispanics, and white Americans. And just as we have committed to help build one America by ending the racial and ethnic disparities in infant mortality and cancer and other diseases, we must use all our power to end the growing disparities in HIV and AIDS. The AIDS crisis in our communities of color is a national one, and that is why we are greatly increasing our national response. Today, I'm proud to announce we are launching an unprecedented $156 million initiative to stem the AIDS crisis in minority communities. It is one of the greatest victories in the balanced budget law I just signed. It never could have happened without the passionate and compassionate leadership of Maxine Waters, Lou Stokes, and the rest of the Congressional Black Caucus. Or the support of Senator Specter and Congresswoman Pelosi, and so many others. Now, this initiative will allow thousands of cities, churches, schools, and grassroots organizations to expand prevention efforts and target them to the specific needs of specific minority communities, such as young men, students, pregnant mothers. It will allow minority communities to expand treatment for substance abuse. It will increase access to protease inhibitors and other new therapies, because life-saving therapies cannot be a luxury reserved only for the rich. It will increase access to skilled doctors and other healthcare providers. And finally, it will help us to assemble teams of public health experts from the Centers for Disease Control and other federal agencies to visit individual communities and provide whatever technical assistance those communities need. This new initiative will build on the other historic funding increases in HIV/AIDS funding we won in the new balanced budget, which Secretary Shalala will talk about in greater detail in a moment. I'm also pleased that it will build on our race and health initiative. Congress has taken a first step to fund this initiative, but we must do more. We are not one America when some of our communities lag so far behind in health. Of course, this room looks nothing like a house of worship except for a few collars I see. But I'd like to end my remarks today with what I think is quite an appropriate passage from the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians. The body is a unit, though it is made up of many parts. And though all its parts are many, they form one body. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. So it is with the body of Americans and a nation that strives to be one America. Every one of our communities is inextricably linked in suffering and rejoicing, in sickness and in health. And that is why we must work together in every community to stop this cruel disease. Black or white, gay or straight, rich or poor, you name it, we have to stop it. Now I'd like to present America's Surgeon General, our nation's family doctor. His deep commitment to advancing our country's health is embodied in the 200-year-old guiding principle of our public health service, that you best protect the health of the entire nation when you reach out to the most vulnerable people. Dr. David Satcher.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you for today, and thank you especially for your commitment to eliminate disparities in health among different racial and ethnic groups in this country. To our distinguished members of Congress and to all of our distinguished colleagues in the battle against this epidemic, I must say it's been a real pleasure working with the Congressional Black Caucus and members of their staff and their constituencies and members of the President's Advisory Council on AIDS to reassess the effectiveness of our strategies to target high-risk communities for the AIDS epidemic. As you know, in the past decade, the complexion of the AIDS epidemic has changed. AIDS is increasingly becoming an epidemic of color. Its makeup has shifted from being a disease primarily of gay white men to being more ethnically, racially, and gender diverse, with a particularly high concentration in communities of color. Now, we've made some progress in reducing the number of new AIDS cases and in lessening the death rate, but the progress has not been equally realized across all communities. And let me just review some of the facts to establish the context for that. The AIDS epidemic was first recognized among white gay males in California and New York in 1981. Between 1987 and 1997, the number of cases ballooned from 50,000 to 641,000 in this country. During that time, the percentage of women represented in these numbers increased from 8% in 1987 to 22% in the 1997 figures. The number of African Americans increased from 25% in 1987 to 45% in the 1997 report, and the number of Hispanics from 14% to 22%. So as you can see, the AIDS epidemic has been changing. And despite the fact that we have seen significant progress in the death rates from AIDS and in new cases, AIDS is still the leading cause of death among African American men between the ages of 25 and 44. And it is the second leading cause of death among African American women between the ages of 25 and 44. So in communities of color, especially African Americans and Hispanics, the AIDS epidemic continues to rage and to be a major problem. These recent data reflect the increased toll the epidemic has taken on women and racial ethnic minorities, and on the young, I must say, because when we received the reports from 1996-97, among new cases between the ages of 13 and 24, 44% were female and 63% African Americans. That's the nature of the challenge we face. Mr. President, your commitment to eliminate disparities in health among racial and ethnic groups by the year 2010 will greatly benefit from a successful strategy to confront disparities in HIV/AIDS. A multifaceted approach is urgently needed. This would involve the development of new partnerships with existing community institutions, national organizations, congressional leadership, and governments at the federal, state, and local level. We hope to accomplish at least three things: to provide technical assistance and to enhance the infrastructure in communities at highest risk for this disease. Secondly, to significantly improve access to prevention and treatment services for communities at highest risk. And thirdly, to better target all of our resources and all of our efforts to those communities that are disproportionately impacted by this epidemic. Let me say that in the final analysis, as you know, government alone cannot solve this problem. But only by working in partnership with communities will we ever see real and meaningful progress. It is only to the extent that we can get people to avoid the risk associated with injection drug use and to make the right choices regarding responsible sexual behavior that we will see significant progress. And it is only to the extent that we can get people who have the disease into quality care programs that we can make a difference. We are committed to an aggressive and informed effort to control the AIDS epidemic in all populations in this country. Yesterday, today, and always, the Public Health Service is committed to protecting the health of the entire nation, especially by addressing the concerns of our most vulnerable populations. Thank you. I am very pleased to have this opportunity. Very pleased. It's a very special lady whom I talk about as I travel throughout the country, but I have a deep appreciation and admiration for her outstanding leadership in this arena, her commitment to eliminating disparities, her bold efforts in this area of the HIV/AIDS epidemic is reaping great benefits. Thank you. Secretary Donna Shalay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, David. He's confirmed. There's no problem here. Let me start by saying that what a privilege it is to work with our Surgeon General. He is a remarkable public health leader. And for him and for the Deputy Secretary, Kevin Thurm, who's here, and all the senior members of the HHS team, this was a labor of love. And I hope that you hear it in both our voices and our presentations. Mr. President, today, October 28th, is an auspicious day for this occasion because today, exactly 200 years ago, was the birthday of Levi Coffin, the founder of the Underground Railroad. If Mr. Coffin were alive today, he would see that we've come a long and winding road since those days of shame. But I imagine that he would be troubled by the crisis of HIV/AIDS in the African American community and other minority communities, which has been kept underground for too long. As the President has made clear, this administration has been committed from the start to attack the HIV/AIDS epidemic in America with every tool at our disposal. With the support of Congress, we've boosted overall funding for AIDS-related programs by more than 90% since 1993. And we've nearly tripled the funding for the Ryan White CARE Act. At the National Institutes of Health, we launched a new vaccine research center, and the President has challenged scientists around the world to develop an AIDS vaccine in 10 years. At the FDA, our quicker AIDS drug approval process has brought forth 9 new AIDS drugs, 20 new drugs for AIDS-related conditions, and 3 new diagnostic tests. And as today's announcement demonstrates, as the face of AIDS has changed, so has our strategies to address it. A substantial portion of our federal AIDS dollars goes to serving racial and ethnic minorities. 63% of participants in AIDS clinical trials sponsored by the NIH are minorities. 40% are African Americans. 42% of clients served by Title I of the Ryan White Act are African Americans. And last month, we made a down payment on boosting the ability of communities of color to fight the health crisis, a down payment on the significant investment the President has announced today. Today is an important milestone, but we have miles to go before we secure the health and health equality for every American. But this milestone today signifies more than a new push against HIV/AIDS. It signifies that when it really counts, leaders in Washington can pull together to respond to the real needs of real people. It signifies, too, that under the President and the Vice President's leadership, we have a creative, responsive federal government. It signifies that democracy works, that a devoted group of lawmakers, of community leaders, and activists can join forces, can raise their voices, can demand action, and can hold our feet to the fire. Finally, this day signifies that we still have real fire-in-the-belly leaders in Congress, giving voice to the voiceless in America, extraordinary leaders. And they include extraordinary leaders like Louis Stokes and Maxine Waters. Dr. King was right when he said every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. Today, we take a giant step towards justice in America. Thank you very much. And now it's my honor to introduce a man whose leadership and concern made this day possible, Congressman Louis Stokes. Let me say this. I have known Congressman Stokes since I was much littler. He was a law school classmate of my mother's. He leaves Congress with our highest praise, with our enormous affection and admiration, in particular for his outstanding leadership in minority health. The Congressman from Cleveland, my dear friend, the Congressman from Cleveland, Louis Stokes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Secretary Shalala, for the very kind words of introduction. And I must say to you that I'm very proud to call this distinguished lady from Cleveland my homegirl. And it is true that her mother and I were in law school together, and while the secretary didn't tell you, I want you to know her mother was #1 in that class. Mr. President, Secretary Donna Shalala, Surgeon General Satcher, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, other distinguished members of the House and Senate, I'm pleased to join with you to launch this unprecedented initiative to combat the HIV/AIDS crisis in the African American community and other communities of color. On behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust, I want to thank President Clinton, Secretary Shalala, Surgeon General Satcher for their response to this national crisis. This is an exciting opportunity, one that builds on the federal government's continuing commitment to address this deadly disease. It is also a prime example of what can be accomplished when the Congress works in partnership with the administration.
The HIV/AIDS initiative that the President will launch here today is the right thing to do. Every hour, 7 Americans are diagnosed with HIV. Of these, 3 are African American. AIDS, as you've already heard from the Secretary General, is now the leading cause of death among African American men between the ages of 25 and 44. It is the second leading cause of death among African American women in this age group. Throughout the AIDS epidemic, the Congressional Black Caucus has continued to fight to ensure that adequate resources are provided to address this critical public health epidemic. The new initiative that is being launched here today is designed to provide critical funding for effectively targeted HIV/AIDS prevention and control efforts, expanding and improving access to state-of-the-art therapies, building and sustaining community infrastructure, and increasing public awareness about the impact of HIV/AIDS crisis. I'm greatly encouraged by the leadership of a number of national organizations who have given leadership in developing this administration-CBC partnership. HIV/AIDS is one of the most formidable challenges to ever confront America's minority community. How well we respond will affect generations yet to come. I also want to join in saying to you that being on the Appropriations Committee and having worked on this matter, that it could not have been done had we not had the great support of Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi and Senator Specter. They were magnificent. And lastly, Mr. President, we thank you for your support. And now I'd like to introduce to all of you my distinguished colleague, the chairperson of the Congressional Black Caucus, whose strong leadership in the area of HIV/AIDS has focused national attention on the crisis in the minority community. A dedicated and distinguished lady, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, the state of California.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Today is a blessed day. And I want to thank President Clinton, Health and Human Services Secretary Donna Shalala, Surgeon General Satcher, and my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus, and all of the other members of Congress for responding to the Congressional Black Caucus's call to address the HIV/AIDS crisis in the African American community. We are so very pleased about today's announcement. The $156 million in new initiatives announced today
by the minority community. A dedicated and distinguished lady, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, the state of California.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Today is a blessed day. And I want to thank President Clinton, Health and Human Services Secretary Donna Shalala, Surgeon General Satcher, and my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus, and all of the other members of Congress for responding to the Congressional Black Caucus's call to address the HIV/AIDS crisis in the African American community. We are so very pleased about today's announcement. The $156 million in new initiatives announced today by our president for research, prevention, and treatment of HIV/AIDS in the African American community is so desperately needed. HIV/AIDS in the African American community is indeed a public health emergency. You heard the president. African Americans are 13% of the population, yet African Americans comprise almost 50% of the AIDS/HIV cases. Our community is in the unfortunate position of trying to address the health needs of African Americans who often lack insurance and are less able to take care of their health care needs, and at the same time to manage the spread of HIV/AIDS, which demands tremendous attention and resources. What has been accomplished this year is kind of the culmination of years of hard work by the Congressional Black Caucus, AIDS healthcare professionals, activists, and community leaders. Congressman Denise Stokes, as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust and as a member of the House Appropriations Committee, was indeed instrumental in helping the CBC secure the $156 million in additional HIV/AIDS funding for the initiatives announced here today. Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, who was very helpful on this issue in the appropriations process, also deserves to be acknowledged. She has. Let's do it again. And Senator Specter. In addition, I want to recognize the work of the Kaiser Family Foundation, which published The Untold Story, AIDS and Black Americans, a briefing on the crisis of AIDS among African Americans. It provided the CBC with the statistics to make the case that HIV/AIDS in the African American community should indeed be treated as a public health emergency. I'd like to say a word about Bishop Carr, the founder of the Minority AIDS Project in Los Angeles and my mentor for many years on this issue, and he deserves special recognition even though he's unable to be here today. The Congressional Black Caucus made HIV/AIDS a top priority of the 105th Congress. When the CBC published the agenda at the beginning of the 105th Congress, we made it our goal to reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS. We've worked very hard throughout the 105th Congress to get us here today. On July 29, 1997, the CBC held a hearing on HIV/AIDS in the African American community. This was followed by a CBC Health Brain Trust, where Dr. Benny Prim, who's sitting here on the front row today, the executive director of the Addiction Research and Treatment Corporation, shocked us when he described the HIV/AIDS crisis in the African American community as a public health emergency. On May 11, 1998, the CBC convened a meeting of almost 100 HIV/AIDS activists, healthcare workers, and community leaders from across the nation to hear firsthand about the impact of the disease in our communities. From this meeting, the CBC called on Secretary Shalala to declare the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the African American community a public health emergency. And let me just say a word about Donna Shalala. We really should give her a big round of applause. She took a lot of abuse from me. She didn't deserve that. Thank you. She never wavered. She never stopped smiling. And each time I said something worse than what I'd said before, she simply said, Maxine, we're going to do everything we possibly can. Give her another big round of applause. On Monday, July 20, 1998, CBC members toured Baltimore looking at HIV/AIDS and drug rehabilitation clinics. On September 17, 1998, the CBC held a national town hall meeting where over 1,000 people heard from doctors, advocates, and those living with the disease. And I'd like to thank Congressman Cummings for organizing a very special trip for CBC members to not only go up to Johns Hopkins, but to go up throughout the community and talk with those who were intimately knowledgeable about what was going on with drugs and AIDS. Please give him a big round of applause. We also worked with the Department of Health and Human Services to develop a package of initiatives to address the crises of HIV/AIDS in the African American community. What we're witnessing here today is the fruit of our collective labor. While there is still more work to be done on this issue, it shows that when we're clear on our goals, we can make significant progress. Let me just say that we could not have done this without the staffs of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressman Stokes' staff, my staff, Donna Christian Green, all of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus. Please give the staffs a big round of applause. And the staff, all of Donna Shalala's staff that she put into action on this, the White House, the Office of Management and Budget. I want to tell you, this has truly been a collective effort with everybody working up until the last minute in those wonderful budget negotiations led by our president to get this money. Thank God for the crisis. With that, I am pleased to introduce Denise Stokes, a community activist dedicated to education, awareness, and prevention. She has been involved in the AIDS education effort for over 8 years. She is now a freelance AIDS educational consultant and motivational speaker. Infected with HIV 16 years ago and diagnosed with AIDS 12 years ago, Ms. Stokes was one of the youngest members of the AIDS community to become active in the struggle for prevention and awareness. Denise was instrumental in gaining access to African American churches in the early 1990s and in being one of the first people to put a face on heterosexual HIV infection. Ms. Stokes now serves as a member of the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. Please give her a big welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Representative Waters. I want to tell you, though, I'm not that young anymore, and that's something I'm very proud to say because it's quite an accomplishment for me. When we talk about AIDS, we talk a lot about numbers that can be overwhelming or intimidating, but we need to look more closely at the numbers until we begin to see the real lives that they represent. Today, I'd like to share a few personal numbers with you. The first numbers are 13 and 16. I was infected with HIV at the age of 13 and diagnosed at 16. While my peers were planning their futures, I was being harshly told that I would not live to see 21. That was the year I realized some children die before they had a chance to live. The next number is 3. That's how many years it took for me to get the information I needed to combat my disease. I didn't learn that HIV was a sexually transmitted disease until I was almost 20. No one in my community was willing to talk to someone else's child about sex or about AIDS. I suffered greatly with a severe case of unanswered questions. Many youth today are being tragically diagnosed in the prime of their lives because we're too timid to talk candidly about AIDS. We are afraid to keep our children alive long enough to make healthier choices. 13, that's how many pills I take each day to help sustain my health. Pills that are not easy to take and that leave me feeling nauseated and tired, but they are all I have right now and they keep me alive. I'm happy to have them. But they are pills that are not easy to come by. Many of my peers have no access to the latest medicines. Therefore, they have no access to the hope being experienced with each new improvement. They sit by and watch people live longer, healthier lives while they still suffer with preventable infections. 5, that's how many hours I spent on a hospital curb lying in my own urine while trying to get treatment for an allergy to an AIDS medicine. 5 hours of suffering when I was only 100 feet away from the source that could alleviate the fierce itching and burning that was ravaging my swollen body. But no one had time to help me. It wasn't in anyone's job description to escort a patient to the pharmacy, especially an undesirable-looking patient like I was that day 2 years ago. I experienced the same indifference that many people in my community experience when seeking care. We are not able to walk into hospitals waving insurance cards or cash. We are not able to access the good quality health care that all human beings deserve. While we muster the strength and courage to take an active role in our care, we're being stripped of our dignity by the system that is supposed to help us. 1, look into the eyes of one person being diagnosed with HIV for the first time. Tell a homeless young man with HIV that he has to wait 1 more year for housing because the resources are not yet available. Tell one young woman that you can't fill her prescription for medicine that will save her life because she has no money. Tell one child that his mother won't be coming home anymore because she died today of AIDS-related complications. Do any one of these things and you will understand what this $156 million means to the Black and other minority communities. This initiative is important because the monies allocated and the commitments made here today will positively impact communities in dire need of support services. And just maybe, not one more of these travesties will occur on my home front. The last number I want to share with you today is 0. I demand that we be liable until there are no new infections, that we do what's necessary to save lives and not what's popular, until there are no more people desperately seeking care only to find the doors are closed, until there are no more people suffering with AIDS. We have to stay committed, just as committed as the President, the Vice President, and the Congressional Black Caucus, just as committed as Sandra Thurman, Secretary Shalala, Dr. Satcher, the Advisory Council on AIDS, and many, many others who have worked tirelessly on this important issue. 0 is our goal, because no more can we sit idly by and watch AIDS consume minority communities. We must maintain the momentum that we have gained today, because HIV is maintaining its momentum. No more addicts needlessly infected with one disease simply because they have another one. Addicts should have services and the tools they need for effective prevention. No more lives thrown carelessly aside, no more memorial services, no more screaming mothers, no more broken spirits or broken hearts, no more disparity in minority communities, no more AIDS. Thank you.
I think that was a very good last word. We're adjourned. Thank you, and God bless you all. Let's keep going. Thank you.